name is Patty Apostolides, the director of the Hellenic Writers Group of Washington, D.C. A few months ago, I was alerted by Dr. Dafnis Panagides about a book Dr. Michael Cosby had written about his late brother Dafnis Panagides, a Cypriot parliamentarian, agriculturalist, and environmentalist. After Dafnis' son Thalis came and spoke to our writers group almost a year ago, I was curious to read about his father through Cosby's book. I learned that they were making a movie about Dafnis. I had a chance to read The Storyteller from Kalo Chorio, and that's Mr. Dafnis here walking down the street, and found this to be an informative and captivating read. Dafnis was an extraordinary man who touched many people's lives in many ways, from Cyprus to America to Saudi Arabia. He was a true leader and a compassionate man. Dr. Diane Helentjaris will be the moderator. And now I give the floor to Diane.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Cosby, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him and then turn it over to him and have some prompts and questions to ask him. He's a retired professor who taught biblical studies for over 33 years. An American, he grew up in the northwest of the country and went to the University of Montana, where he had a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology. From there, he switched directions and achieved a PhD in New Testament from Emory University in Georgia and taught biblical studies. I believe his last post was at Messiah University in Pennsylvania. As a senior Fulbright Fellow in 2011, he researched Barnabas on Cyprus, and there he met Dafnis Panagides, the subject of the book that we're going to discuss today. He wrote other books, many books and articles, including Creation of History, The Transformation of Barnabas from Peacemaker to Warrior Saint, Integrating Biblical Literature, An Introduction to Biblical Studies, Apostle on the Edge, The Inductive Approach to Paul. So he has written quite a lot. And his last book, The Storyteller from Kalo Chorio, was a change of direction. And I'm going to ask him to tell us to start why he chose to diverge from his prior writings to do this book about Dafnis and why he chose Dafnis. Mike.
Well, thank you. I get bored doing the same thing over and over. And so that's why I chose to do a biography. And when my wife and I were in Cyprus in 2011, researching the Apostle Barnabas, of course, the Cypriots would say Barnabas, the abbot of the monastery of Apostle Barnabas, Father Gabriel, gave me this icon. And it was quite an honor to meet all sorts of people there, a lot of fascinating people. Lynn and I grew to love the culture a great deal, but the most fascinating man we met was Dafnis. He was a remarkable storyteller, constantly telling stories. He loved to be the center of attention. And basically, we were just captivated enough that we wanted to know much more about him. We knew that he was part of the first Cypriot parliament, that he fought against the British in the days of Ioka. And he spent years in Saudi Arabia working with the Bedouin and was quite an environmentalist, etc. So we decided to go back in 2017, and we, I don't know how many hours we spent with an audio digital recorder capturing his stories. So basically, we wanted to do his life story because he's just such an interesting fellow and had such an impact on Cyprus. Behind me is St. Hilarion's Castle. For those of you who've not been to Cyprus, it's one of my most favorite places on the island, the Byzantine fortress.
Okay, so Michael, what if any question, sometimes when we write a book, it's because we want to get to the answer. We want to answer a question. There's something we're curious about. We want to discover the truth. What if any question are you attempting to answer with your book about Dafnis?
Well, one of the reasons that I wanted to study the life of Dafnis was I was intrigued when I was in Cyprus on my Fulbright working on the Apostle Barnabas. I discovered that although he is a peacemaker, really good at it in the New Testament, there's not a lot about him, but he was one of the most influential leaders of the early Christian movement. But over the centuries, he became what today in Cyprus I might call a warrior saint. I met a number of Greek Cypriots who would pray to him daily to get rid of the Turks from the island. And I just thought, how does that happen, that a peacemaker becomes a warrior? And so I tracked it down. I mean, it was a huge task, but after translating, I don't know how many passages in Greek down through the centuries, I pieced it all together, how it came about. Fascinating story. And then my wife and I would talk about Dafnis being a pacifist in his later years, but he was a warrior when he was part of Yoka. So how does a warrior become a pacifist? Or in Barnabas's case, how does a peacemaker become a warrior? That juxtaposition just fascinated me. And so we decided that we wanted to explore it. What kind of influence did Dafnis have on the development of modern Cyprus? And there was a lot there.
How do you think a warrior becomes a pacifist? How does someone move from violence or acceptable violence to being anti-violence? And I think that might be something to consider, especially for Americans right now.
Yes. I'm hesitating a little bit because the answer to your question is really quite complex. Dafnis had a favorite story about delivering a letter from a colleague of his, well, not a colleague, a fellow prisoner in a concentration camp in Cyprus. And the man escaped from the concentration camp and was later hunted down by the British and killed. But he gave Dafnis a letter to deliver to his widow, should she become a widow. And Dafnis loved to tell this story. He told it for decades about going to the man's village and meeting his wife and all. But as the story went, he got lost. There weren't many roads in rural Cyprus at that time. And he stopped to talk to a shepherd who was reading a book. And Dafnis said, I never saw a shepherd reading a book before. That just doesn't happen. And so he asked the shepherd if he would direct him to the village. And the shepherd said, yes, I will. You look like an educated man, but I want to ask you a question. If Jesus were dealing with the British, would he take up arms and kill them? And Dafnis said that was a real turning point for him. And he mulled it over for years and finally decided, if I'm called to love my enemy, then killing them is not an option. And so that's the story he told. You'll have to read the book if you want to know how I unpack that whole thing, because there were problems with the story.
Right. I was struck by what you might call a critical point in Cypriot history, where they were trying to decide how to get out from under British colonial rule. Mm-hmm. And the people in charge knew about Gandhi's choice of peaceful ways to do it, but they felt that it would take too long. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, he was recruited by two friends of his to join Yoka, and he was very hesitant to do it he would tell the story in different ways. You know, he usually would say something like, they knew that I would never kill a bird, or maybe it was, I would never kill an ant or something like that. But they convinced him that he really needed to be a part of this movement. And so he finally said, well, let God's will be done. And he joined. And so at that point, because he was under the command of Colonel Grievous, the head of Ioka, basically he had no choice. He did what he was told. And so he was full of stories about it. They were so ignorant that they knew nothing about firearms. And so Dafnis drove his old car up to Nicosia to talk with the Archbishop, Makarios. And Makarios asked him, do you know anything about guns? And they said, no. And so he went over to his desk. This is the Archbishop, reaches into a drawer of his desk, pulls out a Colt 38 Special and says, if you can get guns like this, buy all you can get. So they're just really interesting stories that he would tell about that sort of thing. One time he said they were up in the hills. They didn't have any weapons, so they decided they would ambush a British patrol on a very tight curve on a mountain road. And so they gathered up a bunch of cactus in big baskets, and they were going to dump the cactus down on the heads of these British soldiers. Fortunately for Dafnis and the others, they're alive because the soldiers didn't come that way that night. I mean, but he had all sorts of humorous stories that could have been deadly, not humorous.
Mhm.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder, some of us might not be that familiar with this, the Cypriot history.
Mhm.
If you could take a moment just to tell us, like, who was Ioka, is, you know, and the kind of the pivotal dates of what happened when, you know, as far as that traveling from being a British ruled colony to an independent country.
Well, the Cypriots had for years petitioned the British for freedom, not independence. They wanted to join Greece. They wanted to be a part of Greece. And so enosis was their word, unity. And so the Archbishop in particular, whichever Archbishop it happened to be over the decades, would bring these petitions to the Parliament, and they were consistently rejected. And the Cypriot people just got more and more and more weary of the British refusal to pay any attention to their requests. And so finally, Grievous, who was a Cypriot, but he had moved to Greece, he was a Greek soldier, had advanced to the level of colonel, and a very, very accomplished sort of fellow. He decided that the only way the British were going to give independence was through violence. And so in 1955, now he had scouted the island out thoroughly prior to that, but in 1955, interestingly, on April the 1st, he had his recruits, and he recruited a lot of young people among the Cypriots, both men and women, and we could even say boys and girls. And they bombed multiple targets, military type things, or they knocked out the installation that provided radio for the British people to broadcast their propaganda. And so once that happened, then it just escalated from there. According to Dafnis, Grievous didn't mean for it ever to go too far. He just wanted to call national attention to the problem of the Cypriots wanting freedom, but the Brits refusing to give it to them. The British wanted that island. It's very close to the Suez Canal. It's also kind of a watch place to keep an eye on Russia. And they still have 2 military bases on the island. But Grievous led this revolt for 4 years. And in 59, the British finally capitulated and agreed to give freedom, but not to join with Greece. It was to be a kind of, well, it was a very odd sort of freedom that they set up, independence. And it was destined to fail the way the British and the Turkish, they were always having to figure out who would give what. Instead of letting the Cypriots figure it out, they imposed it on them. And it was a mess, still is.
Mhm. You've spent time personally with Dafnis and certainly studied him and talked to all sorts of people about him and read things and all that. And what's your assessment of what were the strengths that he had that made it possible for him to become pivotal, okay, in Cypriot history and leadership, given that he had also some vulnerabilities?
Don't we all?
Mhm.
Well, I think his characteristic of his personality that made him in a way so effective was he's what we in America would call a people person. He was in his glory talking to people. He loved to be the center of attention. I don't know how long it took us to get places, because we would be driving down the road and suddenly he would, of course, on the left and very narrow mountain roads, suddenly stop because he saw someone off to the side whom he knew. And so they would chat. And it took forever to get anywhere, except when we were really going, because he drove very fast on those mountain roads. But he was an amazing conversationalist. And the one thing that people knew when talking to him was that he cared about them. He had committed communist friends. He had committed right-wing nationalists. He had Baha'i friends. And I mean, Turkish people from the north, the occupied northern part of Cyprus, would come down. One of the pictures you showed at the beginning was a group of people around some picnic tables, well, in front of them. And that was a peace conference. And half of those people were Turkish Cypriots who drove down, crossed the border, got into the Republic of Cyprus. And Dafnis's key word there was, the politicians have totally failed to bring about peace. It cannot come from the top down. So he said, peace must come from the bottom up. We, the people, have to show the politicians how it's done. And he was a very, very persuasive speaker. And he was also scatterbrained. He just had about 10 things going at any one time. And so he couldn't really accomplish a great deal in one thing, because he was also doing something else. And always late. I swear he would have been late for his own funeral if he had a choice. And people knew that, and it frustrated him. But by the time he got there, he was such a fun person to be around that all was forgotten. We just enjoyed being with him. So mostly his communication skills. Plus, he was very widely read. He could talk on any number of subjects, and very effectively. We could go from politics to educational theory to who knows what. And he was quite well read.
I'm wondering, it's interesting to me that you've spent your career doing biblical studies, religion, and more than once, as I read the book, you showed your concern about ferreting out the real truth. Being frustrated by Daphne's dissimulations, or whatever you prefer, lies, okay,
Yeah.
untruths, things that didn't seem to be quite right. And then given that we've all seen these psychological studies where two people go to the same event and relay totally different experiences, or how our interpretation of what happened in the past changes over time as we gain new experience. So given those kind of shifts, and you've spent so much effort on this book, has your opinion of the existence of an absolute truth changed at all, or the role of truth in our lives?
it's made me very cynical about history books. People are complicated, and as you say, perceptions differ. And what one version, and maybe they both participate in the same thing, but their accounts of it can differ. And with Dafnis, his account of an event might differ from one telling of the story to the next. So having the recordings of all these interviews was extremely helpful to try to get at what might have happened. But Dafnis was a trickster. He was good at it. He enjoyed deceiving us. He once said, you can believe maybe 50% of what I said. And, I was talking to Ellie Christodoulides one time, and she said, you can maybe believe 50% of what Dafnis said. So, I heard that. And then he would admit at times that he was just, we would say, jerking you around. He loved deceiving us. And then he would say, now you're just going to have to figure out what really happened. Well, that was tough. And I don't pretend to understand the mind of the man. Way too complex for me. But I think that spending so much time with him, very carefully transcribing the interviews, fact checking, all that sort of stuff, I think I get pretty close. And then I would talk to others that are experts in the field, or people like Rinos Lysiotis up in Nicosia, who was a prisoner with Dafnis at the torture center, basically. And he has written a lot. He kept detailed accounts during his imprisonment. And others like Andreas Karios, who heads the Museum of the National Struggle up in Nicosia. He's a goldmine of information. So by reading written documents, by listening to various accounts and all that, I think that I get pretty close to what happened. But I will tell you frankly that when you're dealing with oral history, it's and frankly, a lot of history is just oral. It might be written in a book, but it's someone's oral account that some historian's written down. And it's tough to get to the truth of it. But so I'll add this. I chose not to do the standard biography kind of format. I thought it would be a crime to take a brilliant storyteller and have a boring account of his life. That would be awful. So I chose to do what we call creative nonfiction, where I try to do the book in such a way that it's approaching how engaging Dafnis was as a person. And I think I did a fairly decent job at that, and it was a ton of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you took on a tough task, and another aspect of that is you were writing about a person who was recently deceased. Mm-hmm. So that there are many people who are alive, who have their own opinion about him, as well as he still leaves behind a family. So maybe you can talk about how you address that for those of us who want to write biographies. It's different to write a biography about somebody who lived and died in the 1800s versus somebody who's only recently deceased.
Yeah. And I was deeply concerned that I get it right. And so the first draft I sent to Dafnis's children, several cousins, good friends of his, and then people like Kyriakos and Emily Markides. Kyriakos is the one that introduced me to Dafnis in 2011. And people who knew him, I wanted their feedback, and it's different to be a son or a daughter of the man and a cousin or whatever. And I wanted to get their feedback on the manuscript, to know what they did not like and what they disagreed with. And it put me in a very vulnerable position to to say, here it is. What should I change?
How did that go?
Well, I got some excellent feedback. Some of it was brutal. I mean, Kyriakos is very blunt and a very good writer, by the way. If you haven't read his Mountain of Silence, it's excellent. But you know, I hate editorial feedback. I really do, because every time I submit something, my wife is the worst. She just has all kinds of things that I need to change. And every time I let someone read it, I know that it's going to mean a lot more work for me. But I want to get it right. And so I endure that. And it always makes for a stronger book. So Dafnis's children, particularly his daughters, had some pretty direct things to say to me about certain parts of the book. I listened very carefully. We corresponded back and forth. And, you know, I think in the end, everybody's on board with it. And so if I have their approval, particularly Felice, the son, we're good friends, and I really respect him. And he's, you know, he's direct with me. And so in the end, I'm satisfied with it. I think it adequately captures a very significant individual.
So you think that's important, if you can do that, to get feedback from others involved in the story?
I think you're foolish if you don't.
Mm-hmm. Now you're a pretty productive writer, you know. You've got a string of books and articles and all that, and we all write in one way or another. And I think we'd like to know, on a day when you do write, what's that like? What's your you know, people always ask, what's your writing style? How do you get things from your head out the door?
I tend to mull things over. You know, everybody's different. I don't think there's one right way to do it, but given my personality, I'll tend to mull things over, and I'll do a lot of research on something, and then I'll sit down and I'll start to write. And then when I come back later, I think, well, why did I say that? So writing for me is hard work. It's time consuming. I think it always takes me 4 times longer than I expect it will. It's trying to craft words, put together a sentence that sounds good and doesn't just, you know, express what I mean. My wife and I actually read my stuff out loud to each other, because you will hear things that you think, oh, wait a minute, that just doesn't sound right. If you're reading it silently, it just doesn't surface stuff like that. So, you know, my advice is, and this is my wife's advice to me, and I follow it, always read it out loud. And let other people read it too. They'll give you some advice.
Yeah. Now, as a biblical scholar, how do you feel about, you know, in the United States, there's separation of church and state, and that's always like a hot issue. Versus in Greece, you know, most everybody's Orthodox, and so there's more homogeneity. So as a biblical scholar, how do you feel about the role of the clergy in Cyprus's freedom efforts or independence efforts? You know, you had clergy participating in what would be fairly violent actions.
Well, not really violent. You know, they were warriors. Yes. Yeah, the church played a central role. Makarios, after all, was archbishop in Cyprus, and you know, he was right there with Colonel Grievous in terms of the conflict. So it's a mixed bag. And today, you know, each group thinks that it has the truth, and the Eastern Orthodox are no different. I mean, as a Protestant, it was funny to me to have people just look at me with pity in their eyes and shake their heads and say, "You're so young." When you grow up, you Protestants, when you mature a bit, then you will see the truth of orthodoxy and you will come and become an Orthodox. So, I never tried to refute that. I was not in Cyprus to teach anybody as a biblical scholar. There were many things I would want to say at times, but chose not to. I was there to learn. And some of the religious leaders are very militant, and some, like Bishop Neophytos up in the district of Morphu, he's very strong on making peace with the Turks and listening to them, and and others are just violently opposed to that. So within the clergy, you have a lot of different approaches. But I'll tell you, some of the most wonderful people that I met were really did not like the Turks. So the guy who did this icon, Father Gabriel, I think he was one of the sweetest, most generous men I have ever known. He died a few years after I left in 2011, but a wonderful man. And he prayed daily to the Apostle Barnabas to rid the island of the Turks. So, feelings run pretty deep.
A lot of paradox.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, your book is out, and I'm wondering, sometimes you have your own opinion of whatever you're writing, and then it goes out into the general public, and you get feedback. You get feedback in reviews, you get verbal feedback, and some of it can be quite remarkable and surprising. And I'm wondering if you've had any surprising reactions from readers, things you didn't expect.
For which book?
The one about Dafnis.
Oh, I haven't received any caustic comments at all.
Mm-hmm.
People enjoy it. It's what they call a good read. It's part travelogue. Lynn and I are in the book throughout the entire narrative because we're interacting with Dafnis, and I'm quoting what he tells us. And in part, I want to explain Cypriot customs that are important to know. And so I weave travelogue, biography, Cypriot customs, all sorts of things, and humorous exchanges back and forth between Dafnis and us. So I think that it's creative nonfiction describes it well.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't been hammered by anybody for, oh man, this is really bad book.
Oh no, I wasn't talking about necessarily bad reviews. I'm saying sometimes you're like, I never thought of that, just responses that you hadn't anticipated.
Well, I got one recently from a fellow in Colorado who has known the Panagides family for decades and knew him at Ames, Iowa, when Dafnis was a graduate student there in horticulture, and loves the family, has been to Cyprus multiple times. And he just said, wow, I did not know, and he listed a number of things about Dafnis, even though I've spent who knows how many hours talking to him. So the fact that Dafnis gave us access to his life, answered all kinds of questions, even people like Kyriakos, who used Dafnis as one of the characters in his books. His name is Lavros in the book. He just said, man, I didn't know that. So I think it's been a good contribution to Dafnis's legacy, and I'm really happy about that.
How would you describe your target audience? People always ask you that when you're writing. Who would you ideally want your book to reach?
I struggle with that. I tell you, imagining the reader is really tough. And I just had to decide, well, I'm not writing this for Cypriots. they already know the customs. They already know the stories about the donkeys, that sort of thing. Americans don't know that. And so I wanted to make it interesting for Cypriots, but I wanted to make it accessible for people from other cultures. And so that's why I explain things that would be familiar to people who live there, but for people over here, no. Now, will I ever have it translated into Greek? I don't know. I might have to rely on Thalys and others to advise me on that. I would not mind at all if someone who was a really good translator and got it right to put it into Greek. But, at this point, it's like, well, most of the people who are going to read it already know how to speak English anyway, so they just read it in English.
Right. And after finishing the book, or just in response to Dafnis passing away, what sort of things do you wish you had been able to ask him?
Oh, mercy, I can't even get started. I had to finish the second edition of my book on the Apostle Barnabas before I could really get into the book on Dafnis, and I was really getting into that. Lynn and I had planned to go to Cyprus to surprise Dafnis for his 90th birthday. And he died like about 10 days before the birthday. And well, it turned out to be a very different trip to Cyprus. Than it wasn't the celebration, but in a way it was. We met with family and friends, and we celebrated his life as it should be. And suddenly I'm 72 and I've lost track of what you asked me.
What did you want to ask Dafnis?
Well, there were things that I knew you lied to me about. He just made them up. And I wanted to say, Dafnis, why did you say that? But I couldn't,
Do you think he would have told you the truth?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. He was such a trickster. And he, like I say, he loved to lead me astray. So, and he was a master at deflection and all. Colonel Grievous taught him very well how to endure interrogation. And so if I attempt to interrogate Dafnis, he was so out of my league that, trying to get him to tell me what really happened. Sometimes I could. I'd push him on something, say, oh, okay. And then he would tell me what really happened, I think.
I was struck reading it about potentially thinking of him as using untruths or omissions of truth just as another tool. Thinking about, you give a story of someone coming into town and looking for him and finding him at a cafeteria, and him failing to tell this person that he was who he was looking for, and it was like he was spinning him out. Just to have time until he felt comfortable, that it was okay to reveal himself.
Well, that was Roy. He didn't know if Roy was, because he's British, he didn't know if he was a spy or exactly what he was. And therefore, he didn't trust him.
So what is it, Michael, that what are some of the things you want to make sure that everyone today hears from you? What would you like to tell us that I haven't asked about?
I think the main purpose I had in writing the book was to tell a good story, okay, but also to show that all of us, as flawed as we are, can make a positive contribution to society. And Dafnis was definitely flawed. He said, I'm no saint, but what a remarkable man. And he made an immense contribution to Cypriot society, and not just Cypriot, his influence went out to other countries as well. So I would want to say that we shouldn't try to be like each other. I shouldn't judge myself on whether I come up to your standard, or try to write like you do because that's the way you do it, or any of those things. I think I need to try to be the best Michael that I can be, and do the things that I do well. There's no way I could ever be like Dafnis, as gregarious as he is, the kind of multitasking he did, all of that. I couldn't do it. And I'm not jealous that I don't have his abilities. I'm just thankful he had them. And then I'll make my contribution in the way I can, and I will try to do a very good job of it. and then not be threatened that I can't be like Dafnis, just appreciate who he is. And so that, I think, is a major point I want to make in the book.
Mhm.
Immense gratitude to Patty, the Hellenic Writers Group, and Dr. Cosby, who did an incredible job of capturing Dafnis, my father, and being very articulate today and responding beautifully to all of Diane's excellent, outstanding questions, by the way, Diane. I mean, you definitely are very good at interviewing people. As Dr. Cosby was sharing some stories, my mind wandered to the past about my relationship with Dad. And one line struck me, which was that of Maya Angelou, who said that people will overlook what you say and what you do, but will never forget how you made them feel. Something along those lines. And I think that kind of captures my dad very well, because in conversations with him over the years, sometimes I felt that he was exaggerating a little bit, but yet I left feeling better having had that conversation or encounter with him. So just wanted to share that and put that out with you. But thank you to all of you, and Mr. Cosby, of course, for such an incredible work and dedication. And of course, Lynn too. Hi, Lynn. So well put together and very accurate. I fully endorse the book, and I had no doubts from the beginning that you would do an amazing job. But if I did have 1%, you completely removed it today. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say that Stahis has problems with his throat. He has Parkinson's syndrome. And if he didn't have that, he would have 60s comments about all of these kinds of things, because he was such a good companion with Dafnis, and they enjoyed each other so much. At any rate, he will perhaps tell me what are the questions he would like to know, or answer if you have any questions that he would like to respond to.
Thank you. That was very kind. I do know that Mr. Dafnis has written a book in Greek, right? Mikro Dafnis. And that Dr. Panagides has, you translated into English, am I correct?
Yes.
It's a Kindle on Amazon, you can read it. Joy, is that your wife's name?
Yes.
He's published the English version of it, right? So we know that there's...
I'll see if I can find it here.
Yeah, on Amazon, if you look up Dafnis Panagides, I did my homework. And so we have Dr. Cosby's version, we have Dafnis Panagides' version, and we have the translated version. So we have what's called triangulation, which is a form of multiple realities coming together to form credibility.
Myself, it's been a real pleasure to be able to be a part of this group. I've enjoyed being able to watch the faces of the people who are listening to the questions and the answers, and hearing about Dafnis. I don't know whether you have been able to see me or not, but I've had a big smile on my face almost the entire time. He was a fantastic man. He really was.
And what did you think about Marula? I called her the saint.
Marula, I never met her, but I would have. I'm sure that I would have really loved
That's
her.
Right, she did pass away. Yes.
Yes, she did. Well, we heard many stories about her, and Dafnis thought she was a saint also.
Yeah, behind a great man is a great woman, right?
Absolutely.
Dalis, do you have something?
Yeah. I just wanted to add about my mother being a saint. My dad would joke about outsourcing prayers to my mom.
Good. Georgia Fundulakis asks, what do you think Dafnis omitted in what he told you? This is to Cosby.
I would love to have talked to him more about Saudi Arabia and other things, but the fact is that Dafnis was really thinking about his Ioka years. So there are 4 years there of his life that occupied an immense amount of his attention, as it did with his friends that I interviewed. And so we got a lot of information about that. I would love to have had more about his environmentalism and that sort of thing. Although I did watch him get an award for, the plaque said he was the father of environmentalism in Cyprus. So yeah, I would have loved to have more time, but honestly, it was a factor of I wasn't there long enough, and it was also a factor of how unorganized Dafnis was. He had to arrange everything, and he was not good. He was not good at that. And so we wasted a good bit of time, but he very much took issue with a Western concept of what he called spending time. We would say, how did you spend your day? And he said, time is not something you purchase. It's not a monetary thing. We in Cyprus would always say, how did you pass your day? We'd never say, how do you spend your time? And I really have thought about that. So for him, having fun along the way was much more important than getting every detail down in an interview. So that's just the way he was, and I learned from that.
Yeah. Diane.
I did have a little final question, and that would be to ask Michael his opinion on the best way to memorialize someone like Dafnis.
That everybody had access to the interviews and could hear his voice. It takes a little bit to get used to his accent and stuff, but his English was excellent.
So have you thought of having a digital archive made public?
I have, but I haven't figured out how to do it.
Okay. I don't know how to do it either.
I would like for it to be housed in a university in Cyprus, honestly, but I at this point don't have the correct contacts to make that happen.
And Georgia says, perhaps the interviews can be part of this book becoming an audiobook.
That Dafnis was stream of consciousness. I would ask him a question, he would tell a story, and then suddenly he was telling another story that connected to it in some way, and maybe it was 50 years earlier, and so our conversations were so free-flowing that it would be difficult to follow all of it if you weren't there, shall I say. You know, and I know what was happening because I was there running the recorder, but I'm not sure how successful it would be to post those. Context is an important part of it.
That's a good point. Very good point. What was your favorite part of the book?
Let me just summarize the way we met Dafnis, because I tried to email him and he was so generous and everything, but he just was not getting back to me. And that's always a complaint that people had. He doesn't answer my calls or whatever. And but when we finally arranged to meet him, it was to be at a McDonald's just west of downtown Limassol. We were there, we were waiting for him, we had made the arrangements, and he didn't come, and he didn't come. It was hot, it was late August, early September, I forget. And basically, we Americans are not used to that heat. And my wife and I were sweating profusely. And the woman who had given us the ride, she was taking others to Paphos to an archaeological dig, and she was grumpy because Dafnis still hadn't arrived. And suddenly, this really muddy four-wheel drive Mitsubishi roars into the parking lot. He doesn't even bother to park in a space. He just stops behind other cars, and he gets out, and he's got this rumpled T-shirt, you know, who knows how many days of stubble on his face. And I'm thinking, here's a guy who was in the parliament and all these things, you know, and I just sort of had a different picture in my mind of what he would look like. And so he came up and he stuck his hand out and he said, "You must be Michael and Lynn. I am Dafnis," you know, and he was just so comfortable in who he was, I guess. And then we get into this muddy Mitsubishi, and he's got T-shirts that he has converted into seat covers. And so through the neck hole, you know, you have the headrest coming out of the neck hole of the T-shirt. And there, just the humor of it all. And he roars out of the parking lot. He drove like an absolute maniac, or maybe I should just say like a typical Cypriot. And that was our introduction. And he was telling stories nonstop the whole time he was driving, waving his rather large cell phone in the air, talking with both hands. And I'm thinking, in this traffic, you really should have at least one hand on the wheel. And we're thinking, what have we gotten ourselves into? And that was just kind of our introduction. I call him Mr. Scruffy in the book. You know, that's the way he looked. He was a wonderful man. Felice, I would have been proud to have him as my father.
I think Maria Karamitsos offered, she says, perhaps you could just add snippets of him telling a story in an audiobook. It would take a bit of work calling them. I guess when we were talking earlier about doing audio. Those are just ideas, you know. Look, everything takes time.
Yeah.
And effort. I mean, we all are writers here. We've all spent countless hours sitting there and writing. So you do the best you can.
Tried to let Dafnis speak with his own voice. So there are a lot of quotations in the book. And, you know, he would tell these just funny stories about an elderly neighbor coming over, and he wanted to know if she'd been to the doctor. No, never, you know. And so he sits down and he looks at her hand and he starts telling her, on the basis of looking at her palm, that she has high blood pressure and high cholesterol, et cetera, and she really needs to see a doctor. Well, he was just making it all up because it fit her age, you know, category. So she finally says, well, I guess I better then. And she went to the hospital and came back, and she was furious with him because she said, here all this time, you're a medical doctor, and I didn't know it. You know, everything you said was correct. And he said, I can never convince her that I know nothing of this. Yeah, those stories were just hilarious. And I think they were mostly embellished because he followed, my oldest son has this saying, never let truth get in the way of telling a good story. And Dafnis loved that saying. And I think he freely embellished stories to make them even better.
This was really remarkable. I really enjoyed it. Please, if you haven't gotten the story and you want not only an informative read, but just a beautiful read, something that will enlighten your day and make you feel so much better, think about getting this book. This is really worth it. I think it's just, I know we all are writers, but writers read each other's works. That's what makes us special. We read all kinds of stuff, and this is top of the line. So I recommend it highly.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas. And I would like to thank Dr. Cosby, Dr. Panagides, Dafnis Panagides, Dr. Dafnis Panagides, Dr. Diane Helentjaris, my son Andonis, and all the members and guests attending today's presentation. We hope you have a blessed Christmas and a happy New Year. Thank you. This closes our program for today. Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
Patty. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry
My
Christmas.
son, if you haven't seen him, there's the one upstairs.
Thanks, Anthony.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Have a great holiday season, everybody.